Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 11 of Book Musings, where we'll take a look at Stephen King's It, a very famous novel published back in 1986. So, as I typically do in these Book Musings episodes, I'm going to talk a little bit about my background coming into the book, why it was that I came to read it, or actually in this case, why it was that I came to listen to it. Then I'll get into, what the book's about. Although this time around, you're not going to hear near as much from me. I figure it's a very famous novel, again, published back in 1986. Almost everyone's heard of it. If you want a synopsis of what happens or a more detailed sort of summary of what happens, if you're not already familiar with it, there's ample summaries available online, for example. They're already easily accessible. But I'll give you a brief overview of what happens in the book, and then obviously I'll get into my musings, my thoughts on the book. What did I take away from it, and then I'll wrap up with giving it a Book Musings grade. Will it make the highly coveted Book Musings Hall of Fame and perhaps even the top shelf? We shall see. And I'll end or conclude the episodes by talking a bit about what might be on tap for future episodes. So that's the game plan, and I'll go ahead and, as I mentioned, begin by talking a little bit about what it was that brought me to It by Stephen King. And if you're at all familiar with the series already, if you've watched the first, the latter half of the first 10 episodes of Book Musings that I've provided, you'll know that I've been reading Stephen King. So it's really probably no surprise that here's another episode, although I probably mentioned that I was maybe done with Stephen King or about to be done, or maybe not going to do more episodes on his books. But lo and behold, here's another one. You're probably not too surprised. I mentioned at the end of, in particular, the last episode I did, episode 10, in his On Writing book, I mentioned how I had started, I think, listening to it on my runs. And so that's what I've been doing the last 6 months, so that I just finished this past weekend actually listening to it. So I didn't read any of the book. I listened to it in its entirety. And that's one of the things I'll mention as kind of a caveat later when I get into my takeaways. I wonder how much that affected my takeaways, if at all. But anyway, I've been at this beast for a while, and I alluded to it again back in the previous episode, which was, I think, published on YouTube back on October 4th. So it's been like 6 months. So I've been at this one a while. And I want to, before I forget, give a shout out to the reader who did a phenomenal job. I feel like it's probably with good reason, right? All the people you hear on a lot of these audiobooks are really good because that's their profession, right? But he really does do a marvelous job. I can't imagine how much work he actually put into it, because he couldn't have possibly, given how well he did, he couldn't have possibly just been reading it, straight through without any preparation. He had to know what was coming ahead of time. So I can only imagine if you just sit down and try to read this thing straight, how much time is that going to take, let alone then preparing and knowing, which different characters are coming up and that you'll have to prepare to have a different voice ready and so on. Phenomenal job, Steven Weber. So that was the narrator. But anyway, so reference that I was listening to it, and so that finally came to an end. It was a long, as I mentioned, and as you're probably, take a look at this, right? It was a long process. So pretty much every time I would run over the last 6 months or so, not always, but typically, I would be listening to then Stephen King's It. So I mentioned I just finally finished it this past weekend, went up for a former professor's retirement party. Shout out to Professor Tom Martin from the University of Nebraska at Kearney. And that's when, on that car trip up there, is when I finally actually finished. So anyway, that was kind of a little bit about my background and how it was I came to it. I should have had this number, but I think I've done an episode on every book other than Desperation, which I read way back when I was younger. I think I've done an episode on every episode or every book that I've read, other than what was this first one? Christine? No, not Christine. Carrie. I didn't do an episode on Carrie, but So I probably read, the whole point was, this is probably like my sixth to eighth book that I've either read or listened to by Stephen King. So let's dive into it. What is getting into, what is the book about? Again, if you want like a detailed summary of what's going on in it, good luck. I mean, they are out there. I actually looked into a few of them in preparation for the video, and they're great. You can find them again very easily. But good luck. I mean, summarizing this, right? Wow. Again, I can't imagine what sort of work that took. To those of you out there who have done the summarizing of this lengthy piece, I can't imagine how much time that took. But anyway, if you want a more detailed sort of summary of what's going on in it, check out some of those. I'm just going to offer you kind of a brief overview before I then get into my thoughts and musings on the book. And by the way, my general disclaimer applies here too, that I like to bring up. I will get into, I'm not going to offer a super detailed analysis of what's going on in the plot and so on, but I will probably allude to different things that happen. So I'll try to sort of flag those moments, but just be warned that they're spoiler alerts, right? That this is serving as your spoiler alert. There may be times where I kind of reveal certain things. So you've been warned. So a general kind of description of what's going down in it is that it's kind of a coming of age story where so I think they're like 11 or 12-year-olds at the time. So this is supposed to have been taking place in 1958 when they're 11 or 12. It's kind of a coming of age story where fighting common nemesis, both human and non-human or supernatural. By fighting these common enemies or foes, they come together. They have very diverse backgrounds and different biographies and so on. But it brings them together, and you get to know these characters very vividly. That's a lot of what's going on in these. What is this? 1,000, not counting the acknowledgments, 1,153 pages of the book. So I would say about half of it takes place back in 1958 when these 7 children are 11 to 12 years old. So half of it's like flashing back to what's going on then, and then the other half is then contemporary days or nowadays, which is 1985, which is again 27 years later than from the initial episode. So like half the book is flashing back to when they're children, 11, 12 years old, and then half the book is then what's going down in 1985 when they have to revisit fighting it, basically. So that's a kind of general, again, very brief overview of what's going on in this masterpiece, you might say. I don't know if it's a masterpiece. We'll find out, but this very long novel. Obviously, a lot of plot details and so on that I'm leaving out, but that's a very, very general description of what's taking place. So now so I'll mention in like my What's on Tap segment later that I'm not doing episodes on every book I read. There's been several books since the last episode on King's on writing that I've finished reading and I haven't done an episode on, but I felt like this was such a process, it took 6 months to finish. And I couldn't not do an episode. I felt like I had certain things that I wanted to say. And so that's, I guess, sort of throwing this out there, why I'm doing an episode on, this and not doing an episode on some of the other books I've read, which I'll mention later. And again, that on tap at the very end in that segment. But there were certain things that it definitely made impressions on me. So I guess the sort of the moral of the story, if you will. And so that's why I'm doing an episode on it and wanted to talk specifically about some of my thoughts here in this particular segment then. So again, diving into some of my thoughts, I guess I wanted to start by reiterating that caveat that I alluded to earlier, that I can only wonder how listening to this novel versus reading it, the text itself, right? I can only wonder how much that affected my experience. So I just wanted to put that out there and here at the outset. It's probably a big caveat. I'm not saying that it did, or that it did so in significant ways, but it's certainly something I thought about, especially given how much of a contrast I had in some of my reactions to this book as opposed to how I felt reading some of the other ones. Just to foreshadow, what's coming up here. If you're familiar with my takeaways from the other books, right, that I talked about in the previous episodes. So I think, anyway, I think it's important to, make sure I emphasize that, I did listen to this as opposed to read it myself versus all the other King books, at least the ones I've done episodes on. I, actually read the text. So throwing that out there, again, not sure to what extent, if any, it actually did affect my takeaways, but it's an appreciable difference, I think, or one that it needs to be at least mentioned. So there, I've mentioned it. So I thought the way I would do my thoughts or musings this time around is breaking it down. I've done this on occasion in previous episodes, but break it down into kind of negatives and positives. And I'll start with the negatives, of which there's more. And I guess I'll also throw this out there while I'm thinking about it. How much of my reaction and general sort of takeaway is a result of, also knowing about all the hype that's associated with this, right? Stephen King's a very prolific, as I mentioned and gone into detail in my previous episodes, right? Very prolific novelist. And so, a very famous book, has multiple movies, right, that were adaptations of this novel. So it had, I had high expectations, you might say, for one of his most famous works, right? Held up there with The Stand, right, as probably the two most well-known, you might say. So I don't know, again, also, I guess that's kind of a disclaimer as well, or a caveat. How much of what I'm taking away is a result of those high expectations I had, given its fame and how those high expectations I had then going into the book. So having said all that, though, again, I'm going to sort of go into some negatives and then some positives, okay, and then I'll go ahead and grade the book, give it a book musings grade. So the negatives. I think I'll start by just saying that my mother, and I alluded to, her, and so her general impressions of Stephen King. I remember her reading Stephen King before, when I was younger, and not so much lately. And so in a previous episode, I mentioned how, I asked her about, what's your issue, or why don't you read Stephen King anymore? And the two things I remember her saying was that he's too wordy. He just goes on and on and on, and then he doesn't, if you will land the endings, right? That the endings seemed unsatisfactory. And I have to, I didn't agree with her necessarily on one or both of those points with respect to all the other King books that I've read up to this point. I do think that both of those apply here, at least in my opinion. It seemed extremely verbose to me. There were times where I just, I almost had to just switch to music or do something else when I was on these jogs. And I think there probably were times actually where that happened, just because I couldn't take the amount of detail. I guess it was just not necessarily the amount of detail, because I've mentioned in some of the other episodes where, hey, if you're really into it, give me more, give me more. So I guess in some sense, the amount of uninteresting detail it must have been this time around for me. Just going on into these, what seemed to be totally not noteworthy details or aspects of, the scenarios. So I would definitely have to agree with that general criticism that she mentioned about all of his works. I think that definitely applies here, that, there are times where he could have just gotten more to the point or stayed more to the general points and not gone into all these nuances. And then the second major critique that she, at least that I remember her referencing, was the endings. And in some sense, I'm just happy that there was an ending at that point. Ouch, right? But other than that, I found the ending unsatisfactory, because in the sense that it just seemed like, it just came out of nowhere in a sense. I mean, you're just going on and on. You have all this various detail, and then all of a sudden they get into this, spoiler alert, this other dimension, and encounter it, and it's sort of final form and finally take care of it. But it just seemed to, after all that, maybe it's a result, like that ending seeming like it came out of nowhere. Maybe it's a result of all the verbose detail throughout the rest of it, right? It's just, you're hearing all these constant details about all these things, and all of a sudden, oh, it's done. I guess that's the most general takeaway about the ending for me, was it just seemed to come out of nowhere. and didn't really, I guess, leave me satisfied, in a general sense. So again, two major critiques that I remember Mom raising about his works in general that I didn't really agree with in general about his other books that I've read up to this point, I think do apply here to Verbose and didn't land the ending, at least again in my opinion. The other thing I'll mention, and I don't remember Mom raising this as an issue, but it's one that I've mentioned in previous episodes, is I'm not a big fan of like supernatural stuff happening in the fiction I read. If it's going to be sort of supernatural, I like it to be as realistic as possible, in which case, how supernatural is it? So what I'm getting at is like, I'm okay with like science fiction sort of stuff about, possible aliens that exist and so on. I'm not as big of a fan of, what I call the supernatural or like, monsters and demons and that sort of stuff. And that is here in it. So, well, granted, they have, human foes. What's his name? Henry Bowers, right? The 7 kids all unite in fighting that common human foe. They're also fighting it, which is got all sorts of supernatural abilities throughout the novel. So, if you're not a fan of that sort of thing, which I'm not, as I've detailed in previous episodes, that's not going to be something you're a fan of here either. So naturally, and there's a lot of it here versus some of his other books like 11/22/63 that, as I think I mentioned in that episode, that wasn't really an issue for me at all, because other than the idea of time travel, which to me is on the realistic end of the spectrum, there's nothing that would qualify as, that I recall anyway, as supernatural in that book. It's on the complete other end of the spectrum. It as in this, right? This novel is on the complete other end of the spectrum, where most of what's going on, a lot of what's going on, involves the supernatural. So maybe not a big deal for you. Maybe you get into that sort of thing. For me, though, that's going to count as a negative when it's at least as prevalent, especially as it is here. I have to say, so just like the ending kind of came out of nowhere, I don't understand how they got out of the sewer. So there, spoiler alert, and kind of make sure you're of the appropriate age to hear what follows, I guess. But basically, there's this, and I had known about this scene. A friend I had talked to, as I was reading it, had mentioned, "Oh, did you get to, this particular scene?" And so that sparked my curiosity. I had looked into this, and so I knew this particular scene with Beverly in the sewers at the end was going to happen, and yet it still seemed to come out of nowhere, to me at least, when it did. And so it happened at the very end. So I want to talk about it here and just say that I don't understand. I don't understand why that happened. Stephen, were you just blitzed? Were you annihilated on drugs when you wrote that part? Because it makes no sense to me where she gets this idea out of seemingly nowhere, right? Because it comes out of nowhere, that part in the novel. So again, spoiler alert coming, and this is sort of maybe not suitable for work sort of scenario here, but they're lost in the sewers, and so Beverly suddenly figures out, I guess, after they've exhausted, several other attempts to figure out, where they're going and how to get out. Oh, well, if I just have sex with each of you, then, that'll renew our confidence and we'll figure things out. And so that proceeds to do precisely that. And lo and behold, it works. I don't know why. It doesn't make sense to me. And I just want to make note of that it was mind-boggling to me. I was wondering, again, given that I knew it was coming, how it would be actually situated, how it would come to fruition in the novel itself, right? And I have to say, I was very mystified by it. I didn't understand it. I was hoping that it would make some sense, right? But it really didn't to me. So, and I'm not sure that it would make sense to me if I was annihilated, as I put it earlier, on drugs either. Like, I don't know in what realm or world this, even in other dimensions, let's say they were somehow there, how it would make sense, right? That's going to suddenly get them to figure out, or who was it, Eddie, that was good with directions, or was it Richie? One of the two whoever it was that was good, I think it was Eddie, good with directions, for him to suddenly figure out he had led them astray. I don't get it. So I wanted to address that particular scene, that mind-boggling scene that I have to say, agree with the critics, I guess. Not that it was like a huge, the subject, what actually happens. I guess I have a little issue with that. I mean, if it doesn't seem to fit, especially like if it makes no sense in the context, like why put it in there? But it wasn't necessarily that was the biggest issue. It was just like it made no sense. Like why did this have to be put in? You could have come up with something, way better. I feel like as a kind of an inspiration or something that would have, led them to figure out that they were, where their error was, and to find the way out. Why this? It didn't make any sense to me. So generally, lots of negatives, especially in comparison to my feelings and generally positive feelings that I had associated with all the other works that I've read by him. Just want to say that was my general takeaway. And really, towards the end, when is this thing going to end? I think it got a little bit better towards the end, I'll have to say, but I was just ready for it to end. And I remember thinking like, man, I'm almost ready for this to end like halfway through, to be honest. So in general, lots of negatives, unfortunately. I did finish, so there is that to be said, and I think maybe the only types of books I wouldn't actually finish, knowing myself, would be like something that would get an F. So at least in the book Musings grade, right? But stay tuned for the book Musings grade. But just wanted to emphasize that in general, my takeaways were certainly on the negative end of the spectrum. And I know that's probably a pretty controversial take, so to speak, on the novel, but I wasn't, generally speaking, a big fan. Before I get into the book Musings grade, I did want to mention some positives. So I will say there were some very eloquent passages throughout the novel where I found myself marveling again at his genius and his way with words. He is a great writer. I think that the book was just too long. Certain things didn't make sense, among other things, the ending for my liking, but there's no denying, that he is a great writer. And so that still shines through, especially in particular parts. I found myself recognizing that in the novel. So I want to concede that, and recognize that he's still a great writer, despite my negatives that I've alluded to, and that there were certain parts in particular where I just remember thinking, oh wow, that was really well said, that was really well articulated, or alternatively, I'd never thought of that, certain times where it was fairly philosophical. So I wanted to acknowledge that there were those moments in this novel, and in general that I still think of him as a very good writer. Also, granted that there's too much detail in general, I will say that I think that he does another marvelous job of carving out very interesting characters, naturally giving them lots of detail here, right? But very interesting and dynamic and different characters. They seem all seem unique. One of them, the main character, is stutters throughout the novel, which is again a testament to Steven Weber. Amazing job with the stutter. It did get annoying to constantly hear the stutter. And no offense to anyone with the stutter, but like to hear that, I think it added to the length of the sense of the experience, right? Where it's just when you're already wishing it would be more succinct, adding a character that stutters only complicates things. But kudos to Weber for a fantastic job with emulating the stutter as well. So, but King, the main character has a stutter. It has an interesting background. The novel begins with him losing his brother. Spoiler alert! I should have said that 3 seconds earlier, I think. But losing his brother to it, which then leads to all this transpiring. But so there's that character, and then you have Richie, who has all these interesting voices he tries to do and characters that he assumes, and so he grows up and becomes I think he does these impersonations on the radio, And then you have Eddie, whose mom is a hypochondriac and always tells Eddie he's sick and so on. So, and then Beverly, who has an abusive father, and all these, interesting characters. So kudos to King. While it's verbose, too long, he did a great job still providing characters that I was, at least for the most part, invested in. Okay, let me go ahead and just dive then into my book musings grade. You can probably already tell, as I've tried to emphasize, that my general takeaway from this, from reading, or I should say listening to it, was not very favorable. And so while there were some redeeming qualities to the experience, or it wasn't all bad per se. It was generally again, I would say an overall a negative experience. So it's certainly, I would say, the best one I've read, best piece, I guess, was his nonfiction piece on writing. Love that. Talked about that in the previous episode, actually. This would have to be the one that I liked the least, so far at least. And we shall see how long before I read another Stephen King book, but definitely the one I've liked the least so far. And I was going to say that was it the earliest one that he had written that I've read? And it's not. I liked Carrie. That was literally the first one that he got published. So, what is it about it? I guess I should reiterate, maybe it's listening to it that had something to do with it, my takeaways. Maybe not. I don't know. But I think it might be worthwhile echoing that point again before I deliver my grade here. All of that having been said, right, what is my book musings grade for it? I'm going to give it a D+. So it wasn't so bad that I couldn't finish, even though there were times where I, almost thought about it. It wasn't, so it wasn't an F, right? It's not, it had redeeming qualities, but generally, right, it was not a pleasant experience. And so I wonder, and I know there's a huge fan club out there, this isn't going to be a popular opinion, so I'm giving it, again, a D+. I can only imagine what sort of flack I will get from all the fans I know of this book out there. I know that there are people out there that are huge fans of this novel, so I'm curious, what it is. Being a fan of Stephen King myself, I would say in general, as I've mentioned throughout many of these episodes, I would like to know what it is that you find so appealing about it. Maybe you're more into, I guess, the coming of age sort of story. I guess I thought I was somewhat into that narrative, but maybe I'm not as into that narrative as other people. I don't know what it is, but in general, I just again didn't have a favorable impression of reading or listening to Stephen King's It. So it's going to get far from the top shelf, almost the bottom shelf. D+. Stephen King's It gets from me. So before I leave you, as I like to do at the end, I like to conclude these book musings episodes by talking a little bit about what might be on tap. So I mentioned this earlier that I just don't have the time to do an episode on every book that I read. Although I would like to, I always have thoughts. I don't have, again, the time to flesh those thoughts out and do an episode on every book. But I wanted to mention that some of them a lot of these books I had finished since reading and doing an episode on writing. I had alluded to in previous episodes as well. So like The Science of Fear by Daniel Gardner, I finished that one. I think that's up here. Moonwalking with Einstein, a memory book by Joshua Fair, I think is how you say his name. I finished that. The Authoritarian Moment by Ben Shapiro. I read that, I think, in January or February. Revolution by Russell Brand. I picked up a bunch of his books and read that book, and many, many others. So I just wanted to mention that, again, a lot of those books that I have been referring to in previous episodes in the On Tap segment, I've actually read. I just never did episodes on those. And I would say general impressions, not to get into any detail really on any of those, that I did enjoy reading, all of those, but just, again, due to time, not enough time to do a deeper dive and do an episode on them. So what's next? Will I actually I don't know, will I take a break from King? I mentioned that I might when I did my previous episode, and lo and behold, I'm doing an episode, right? Or I did this episode. So I told my son that I think I'm taking a break, not a divorce, right, from Stephen King. I'm taking a break, though. At least that was the suggestion after I finished it, in the car on the ride up to Nebraska. I talked to my son and suggested I think I'm ready for a break. But then on the car ride back, what else was I going to do? But I put in The Stand and started that. So, and I liked the beginning. There's 37 discs. I've completed the first two. Liked it. I liked the beginning quite a bit. So, will I take a break? I don't know. I can see myself. My last run, I did just listen to music, but I could see myself, listening to The Stand as I run, right? And just like I did with it. We shall see. So, The Stand might be in the works. We'll see. Gifts of the Crow is a book. I don't think I've talked about crows, but this is something. So I picked this up after I think I had watched some sort of YouTube video, and had gotten into crows and how interesting crows are, which I had never really known about. So proportionately they have super big brains, I guess, and they're really smart. Which again, I'd never known any of this, and so I found this really fascinating. I shared this particular video with my kids, and they were all kind of into it. So now we're always on the lookout for crows, and so picked this book up as well. And we've had this in our van, and so sometimes my wife will, as we're going on trips and stuff, she'll read some of that out loud. So that's on the radar. Philip K. Dick, I think I might have mentioned him. It's been a while since I've done an episode, right? 6 months ago, I did the previous episode on King's on Writing. But I think I mentioned how I was interested in Philip K. Dick in one or two of these previous episodes, and so I picked up some of his books and might be diving into them. One of my former instructors, in fact, perhaps the best instructor I've ever had, arguably, Dr. Gene Finch, when I went up to the retirement party past weekend, learned that he had a new book that just came out, and so was glad to pick that up because I'm actually a fan of Albert Camus myself. So I was excited to hear that he had not only just published a new book, but was on Camus, who, again, I'm a big fan of. So looking forward to maybe reading that next. Actually, what I'm reading right now, and then I'm almost done with, and I can almost guarantee you I will have an episode on because I am really enjoying this, and that's Terence McKenna's Food of the Gods. What is the subtitle? The Search for the Original Tree of Knowledge, A Radical History of Plants, Drugs, and Human Evolution. So Terence McKenna, someone I didn't necessarily know too much about. I think I came across him on a Joe Rogan podcast initially, but have become sort of interested in after hearing some of his ideas. It just seemed really intriguing. I had never heard of some of the suggestions. So for example, one of the things he talks about in here that I find intriguing is like interspecies communication, communication chemically through different species. Is that going on perhaps? Does nature have a mind, an intelligence, right, at a sort of level we're just not appreciating? All these things he kind of gets into. You might be familiar with the stoned ape theory, and he gets into that in quite a bit of detail as well. This idea that there's this part of our history, and I'm not well versed in this, so I don't know it too well, but he gets into it, right? There's a part of our history and our evolution where suddenly our brains just got really big and our intelligence seemed to get really big, and it couldn't be. It's not well explained, just given how things traditionally were working out. It seemed to sort of exponentially get bigger and better. And so what he posits is that, the stoned ape theory, that humans came across basically magic mushrooms, some mushrooms with psilocybin in it, mushrooms with psilocybin in them, and they started eating these mushrooms, which then enhanced, or would that be the right word, enlightened them to some extent, enhance their consciousness. And so anyway, all these are very interesting ideas that I didn't know too much about going into the book. So very fascinating stuff. Again, things that I hadn't been too familiar with, and so I'm eager to flesh out my thoughts and dive into some of my thoughts on what he has to say. So you can look forward to probably the next episode being on this, and I think I'm on the second to last chapter, so that would be imminent probably. The last thing I guess I'd mention is that ancient philosophy is still in the works, preparing to perhaps teach that be the next class that I would offer through Johnson County Community College. So I've been reading through some of that anthology and revisiting some of the Greek philosophers from that time period. So anyway, I guess that's it. I'll wrap up this episode 11 of Book Musings, where I discussed Stephen King's It. Not one of my favorites, to be sure. Some redeeming qualities in it, but again, generally speaking, not a huge fan of it. I hope you enjoyed the episode nonetheless, and I look forward to the next episode.